There were many servants within the walls of the Nyansvar castle. The needs of the royalty, the nobility, warriors, and such always demanded care. Those allowed in the castle were granted servants as a perk. But such was the mindset of palatial snobs that even the servants were subjected to a classist system. The more senior servants, those who had gained the favour of the king and queen, or the men closest to them, were housed in small cottages with room for 3 or 4. The cottages were sturdy and lined with grey mats, wooden walls, and bamboo doors. Most were permanently separated into 3 rooms. These cottages usually housed generations of servants, from great-grandparents to the newborn. The so-called lower-class servants slept outside the castle's walls in large, open-spaced, barn-like dorms without walls. The rooms were often crowded with several different families and their kin. The occupants' only privacy came from using brilliantly colored room dividers made of light bamboo and draped in rice paper screens. Although crowded, the dorms had an air of elegance afforded to them. Empress Shayla herself had demanded repair of the facilities once she learned of the squalor the servants once lived in. Foundations were rebuilt, stone beds were replaced with hay mattress pads, and linen sheets were distributed to everyone. Curtains were added to bare windows, and bamboo chutes replaced gritty dirt floors. Males of lower-class servitude were kept in a completely different area, which meant the husbands and wives had to manage their time carefully. Men drafted into the king's army were allowed to see their wives once a sennight when they were granted leave for the day. During the war, men saw their wives only after the last battle was fought. The warriors would return home after the battle and hungry for hot food and for their wives. 9 months later, a population boom would stagger the province. Food in the townships would be in short supply because all supplies were diverted to the armies. With warriors home and with new mouths to feed, crops had to be rationed to survive until more crops could be planted, or until the next war provided much-needed supplies. The last battle fought was 11 months ago when Safford led the army to defeat savages in the northwest outskirts of the Nyansvar province. It was called the Battle of Red Stone. The warriors had another, more fitting name for it. They called it the Bloody Battle of Deadstone. Safford lost 200 men in that battle. They'd underestimated the savages and paid dearly for it. When the warriors returned home, they were sent out again to fight the raiders, who were becoming more than a nuisance. The brutality of the raiders and the randomness of their attacks presented a major problem for Safford. He did not know where or when to deploy his troops. As a result, men were allowed to see their wives only once a month, and now the dorms housing servants were filled only with women and children. The duties of the lower-class servants ranged from shepherding the king's flock to maintaining the imperial farm, cleaning the castle, maintaining the meticulous landscape, or polishing the abundance of marble columns throughout the citadel. Most importantly, lower-class servants served the higher servants, who tended to the queen. It was in a dorm for lower-class servants that Sabiot, Wei, and a third warrior had burst into. It was lined from wall to wall, with cots and makeshift beds lying atop pallets of hay on the floor. The sun had fallen long ago, and all of the women were asleep in the darkness. All except one, Luli. Luli was an older servant, not like the teenagers who were the preferred domestics to handle the laborious work required to maintain the beauty of the castle grounds. Women half her age were ordered as items bartered for at a farmer's market. They were unskilled, but they were young and resilient. The most mundane and back-breaking chores were given to the young. Luli was free from that madness. She'd done her share of arduous work. Although she was a lower-class servant, Luli was trusted. Now, the young servants reported to her to get their assignments for the day. And why not? Luli was old enough to be their mother. If not for the lines along the corners of her eyes, a sun-freckled complexion, and wrinkled hands that had endured decades of scrubbing, scouring, and digging, Luli's beauty would have kept her among the throngs of young servitude. But she was a woman, and she had to begin doing what women did at a certain time: have children. Luli was breastfeeding her 1-month-old baby when Sabaoth burst through the doors. He and the other warriors stepped over the women, sleeping in mats across the floor. They snatched blankets off the girls and pinched their face Ano kriaka, the house of Mard, Kershi or near Ardery, thumb and forefinger, as they compared their pretty young faces to an aged woman drawn on rice paper in their hands. Then Sabaoth's eyes met Luli's. She locked onto his gaze and saw a combination of malice and lust. Her full breasts were exposed, and ordinarily she would not care. Feeding children was an honor only bestowed upon women, and she was proud of her ample ability to feed the new baby in her arms. But the glassy, angry look in Sabaoth's eyes spelled danger. She knew immediately what he was after. She covered herself and clutched her baby tighter. Moments later, Sabaoth carried Luli's child through the back gate into the grounds of Niensvichit Castle. Behind him, 2 warriors pulled Luli along, kicking and screaming. They had her child, her only child, and she fought as best she could against the powerful men to get her daughter back. Unfortunately, the look in the warriors' eyes tells a scary story. The men had seen their brethren's backs caned raw per the king's command. Now they wanted payback. And if they had to make Luli suffer, they would. Wei, the largest of the warriors, with a red battle scar on his neck, the shape of a lightning bolt, had quickly grown tired of Luli's feeble resistance. To him, she was like an annoying gnat buzzing around his face. He smacked her with the back of his hand. Everything went black, and Luli dropped to her knees like a puppet with broken strings. She was dazed and wobbly for a moment and tried to stand, but Wei shoved her, and she fell on her hands and knees. "Kneel, you servant pig," Wei commanded, as he drew his sword and prepared to slam the blade down on Luli's neck. He tightened his grip and sneered as Luli turned to glower back at him, face to face. She had no fear. There was only anger for what these men planned to do with her child. She cursed him with her eyes, and Wei knew it. Wei grinned at Luli's useless attempt at courage. Her protest was to no avail. He raised his sword higher for good measure. Then he stopped. His eyes were focused on something in the distance. Luli closed her eyes. This was a hoax, a trick to disarm her and catch her off guard as the blade sliced her neck and her head rolled off with surprise embedded in her dead eyes. She would not fall for this evil, angry man's fakery. She held her breath, awaiting the fatal blow. Then she heard footsteps. "Lower your sword!" A voice boomed with a monotone, matter-of-fact delivery that gave Luli chills. Wei, the warrior, immediately lowered his sword. He didn't even think twice about it. He wouldn't dare to. Luli had to see who this man was. Her mind grasped the possibility of hope. Not for herself, but for her daughter. Surely someone who commanded such authority would be reasonable. She slowly turned her head and saw his face. Unafraid, she locked eyes with him and held his gaze. He was a powerful-looking warrior, a man with a slight build but whose skill resonated outward as a beacon. His aura was ripe with worldly experience. He wasn't like the soulless warriors beaten and trained to feel nothing. This man had kindness in him. There was a soul she could reach. Luli could not stop the tiny emergence of hope that curled the edges of her lips into a smile. Safford marched forward. He was cascaded in light from behind, from the torches burning on the wall. In front of him, the reflections of the torches in the fountain pool, laced with lilies, added a glow to the dark shadows on his face. As far as Luli was concerned, he was glimmering.